Rachel, are you on mute? I'm sorry.
Yeah, you're on mute, Rachel.
Yes, I was just telling everybody to mute themselves. I hadn't realised I was also muted. So sorry, good intervention there. Thank you very much. So yes, I'm just saying to anybody who's just joined us, we are now live streamed onto the YouTube channel. So if you don't want to be visible to people, turn your videos off. Thank you to Karen as well for reminding us to mute ourselves through the presentation. We'll then have questions at the end. Before I introduce you to Karen, can I also just reiterate some pleas that are going out, both in the newsletter when it's published later this month and also in the emails that you'll be getting from me. We're very keen to get more people involved in all aspects of what the club does. So very keen for anybody who would like to come and assist in setting up talks for next autumn winter, for setting up any site visits that we might have over this summer. You might wish to talk yourself, you might want to lead a site visit, or you might just want to suggest one or to organise one. So any help at all, please. We'd love more people to be involved with that. But we've also got two on-the-ground projects now. We've got the Wildflower Garden at Pools Cavern, which we're doing jointly with BCA. So if any of you fancy doing weed culling or hedge building or planting of stuff, there's lots of things to be done, and you'd be most welcome to come and join in with that. And we've also now got the Serpentine Walks project approved by the council. So we're trying to improve the Serpentine Walks with biodiversity. And again, there are lots of jobs that can be done there. And so if you fancy, you don't have to commit to weeks and weeks, you don't have to commit to hours and hours, you can just pitch up one time, or you can just keep coming regularly. And the same sorts of things, planting of things, pulling things up, putting up bird boxes, all sorts of things that we're doing. So if you're interested in any of that, please do get in touch. I can add you to the mailing list, and then you can get involved as much or as little as you'd like to. Right, that's the advertising bit over and done with, thank goodness. Sorry to take up your time. So moving on to tonight's talk. We're really lucky to have Karen Lloyd talking to us tonight about her new book, Abundance, Nature and Recovery. Karen is a writer of fiction and poetry and journalism, and she's the writer in residence with Lancaster University's Future Places Centre. This is her third non-fiction novel, I think, book, sorry, that she's written. I hope I'm right in saying that, Karen.
Yep.
And I've just been reading it, and I have to say, it is the most wonderful book. It's lyrical. It covers a huge geographical range. It talks about all sorts of wildlife in all sorts of places. And it also reflects Karen's own expertise and her wit and her passion. So if you're looking for a good book to read, I can really recommend it. And also, if I just read you a couple of bits from reviews, it's an essayed book. So the essays in Abundance are characterised by an admirable urgency. Lloyd's is a voice for now. Her ways of seeing reel in not just the deep wounds at the heart of nature, but also glimpse moments of hope, of healing. You want to know how to help nature to heal? Read this. That's how. And the second one is, we live at a time when our writers need to challenge our apathy. How true is that? And call out our lack of ambition in restoring Britain's nature. Very few are willing to do so. But in abundance, Karen Lloyd opens up new pathways to a reimagined relationship with the wild. So, Karen, over to you, and we're really looking forward to hearing what you've got to say. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Rachel. Yeah, so I just think one of the good things about Zoom is you don't have to go and get stuck in a traffic jam on the M6 on your way to a book gig, which once happened to me with the first book when that came out, but there we are. And the weather's terrible, so it's nice that we're all able to be in and warm. So I grew up in South Cumbria, a small market town called Ulverston, which some of you might know of. And I think I wasn't very fortunate in terms of having parents who were able to translate the natural world for me. So it's something I came to quite late, really. And as I grew older and started walking in the hills and getting into the Lake District, I had this impression that I was going into a wild place. And so I'd kind of pack up my sandwiches and get the rucksack and go off into the hills whenever I could as a young adult, expecting to see things, and I didn't see them. And really, living here for most of my life and sort of gradually building up a repertoire of knowledge about the natural world, you know, there's very good reason why you don't see very much wildlife in the Lake District. So I'm going to speak more about that later, but just to say that I wrote 2 books previously. One was about a journey around the edgelands of Morecambe Bay, which is a kind of start out in what some people call nature writing and social history, archaeology, a whole mishmash of things. And then the second book, The Blackbird Diaries, was looking, I wanted to sort of pay attention to the garden because there was a lot of nature books out there, but not many of them did that kind of paying close attention to the garden. So that was a kind of nice thing to do in the discipline of writing a diary every year. But through that book, I got more and more into writing narratives about what was happening to some of our species. So like curlew's big time trouble, what had happened to the golden eagles in the Lake District, why they were no longer here. And then looking at places also like the Isle of Mull, where wildlife's abundant, and what creates the difference between the two. So it's really been a journey, I think, building up my skills as a naturalist. I'm still quite a rubbish naturalist compared to you guys, I'm sure, but it's really been a journey. And I suppose the genesis of this book came from 2 places. One was, you probably all know Mark Cocker, and he organised a trip for a bunch of writers to Extremadura in southern Spain. And so we all went off down there. And here we are with this very huge agricultural landscape with lots of managed land, managed for food production. But it was still, nevertheless, absolutely chock full of wildlife. You know, if you want to see birds, go to Extremadura. If you want to see plants, go in the spring. Just incredible, you know, the species list. So I was trying to work out, well, what's the difference? Why do you have all that there? And we in the UK, and in particular in the Lake District, this wild place, we have actually very little. So that was one of the things, one of the questions that was kind of hovering overhead. And then the second thing was that I have a good friend, Astrid, who was brought up in the Harz Mountains in Germany, and her father was a forester, and her brother had gone into international forestry protection, and he had told Astrid a number of years ago, he was one of the first people to understand that wolves were actually coming back into countries in Europe from where they'd been absent. And the reason they were travelling back was because they'd been given protection, they'd been given legal protection. People were no longer allowed to shoot them. And so guess what? The numbers, you know, the wolves travelled out from their strongholds, and before you knew it, there were wolves being seen on the streets of European suburbs, outskirts. And that really kind of sparked my imagination, and it made me think, you know, we're not always very good at telling good news stories from the environment. We're very good at reading the newspaper. Journalists are very good at telling us what's going, and we have to know that stuff. But I kind of thought there's room for another narrative, which is about saying, let's look at things differently. let's go and look at some of those people who are restoring species or habitats, and let's tell some of their stories. So so that's what happened. I had 3 years to write the book. I did it as part of my PhD at Lancaster in creative writing, and then very fortunately got published by Bloomsbury late last year in the UK and then in the US. So that was the first time I've been published in the US. So just to give you a bit of an overview of the book, it does have a certain narrative arc. It didn't have to start with. I just saw it as a book of a series of literary essays. And when I say essays, I don't mean scholastic essays. I mean a kind of nice, very easily readable literary form. And you can play around with style with that. And after I'd written so many of the essays, I realized it needs something to help readers to understand where I'm going to go. And so that first essay is called A Primer for Abundance. And one of the things that I talk about in that essay, it starts with me being on holiday on the Isle of Mull. We'd just arrived at this holiday cottage, and there was a willow warbler trapped in the conservatory. And so I had this opportunity to look at this bird very close up. And that kind of lens of seeing is really important to the book, because of course how we manage land depends on how we look at it, how we think about it, and so on. And then one of the other things that I do is I talk about paintings, and I'm trying to move on to the next, and I've frozen Rachel, and I don't know why. It says I'm screen sharing and it won't move on again. I don't know if you can move it on. You're on mute.
Yeah.
I don't know why it's not happening. We could just try and stop sharing and then.
Yeah, if you stop sharing, then reshare. Maybe
Yeah.
that will. Yeah.
Hold on a minute. We had a dress rehearsal yesterday and it wasn't playing ball. Oh, let's try it this time. No, it's not going to do it. I'll just go back. Actually, sorry about this.
Use your arrows, Karen.
Yeah, I am doing.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's frozen again like it did yesterday. Well, try once more. So I don't know what to do now because nothing's happening. Right, so anyway, I'll carry on. You can't move it at your end, Rachel.
I'm just going to try.
So the point of talking about paintings was that there's a painter called Mary Newcomb, who she lived on the Suffolk-Norfolk border, and she was a fantastic painter of the natural world and of people who lived in that world as well. And she painted a painting, which I hope you're going to be able to see, called A Football Leaf Seen Through a Hole. No, a football match seen through a hole in a leaf, eaten by caterpillars. And it is a tiny little hole. And if you get your eye in the right way, I don't think you've got it on your selection. I think I added it today, sorry. You start to see things that you would otherwise wouldn't have seen. So it's all about perspective. So that first essay really sets the scene. And I talk about the losses from agriculture in the UK in terms of wildlife. We are something like the 7th most nature depleted. No, we are the most nature depleted country in the whole of the G7. And that's really a shocking indictment of where we've got to. And then there are essays about going to meet the people I call the wolf people in the Netherlands, to look at wolves coming back into that country, essays on Extremadura, a couple of essays from Hungary, one about beavers in Perthshire in Scotland, an essay about Capercaillie in the Cairngorms, an essay on Prespa in the Balkans, northern Greece, then an essay about the Lake District, which I'll come back to, and an essay about meadow adders, one about going to the Carpathian Mountains in Romania to look at illegal logging and forestry protection, then an essay called Cathedral Thinking, which is about, well, you know, again, coming back to that idea about how we actually look at things. So the book is kind of bookended in that way. And then the final essay is about what's going up to the far northeast of Scotland to watch geese arriving from the winter migration in Findhorn Bay. So so that's the sort of narrative arc, and then yeah, so that's that. So I'm going to read you something from the essay on wolves. Is everybody hearing me okay? Oh, Rachel's got the thing up. That's brilliant.
Yeah, hearing you fine.
Yeah. So I'll just talk a bit about the wolf. Wolf people was an absolutely amazing experience. The wolf on the screen actually was not a wolf that I saw in the Netherlands. Unfortunately, or fortunately, whatever, it's a wolf in a wildlife park in Hungary. And I think it was quite an elderly wolf. And, you know, this is how most of us would get to see animals like this. I did see a wolf in the Netherlands, which I'll tell you about in a little bit. But basically, the Netherlands had no choice about wolves coming back. These animals had set off traveling. They were traveling out of Poland. They were moving in from the Alps, and they were in Belgium, they were in Germany, they were on the German border right near the Netherlands. And so the government knew that they were coming, and they knew that they had to plan to, as they saw it, they had to plan to receive the wolf. And that's why the essay is called To Receive the Wolf. And really that speaks to a huge ideological change to the way we would think about wolves. I mean, we live in an island nation. We don't have any chance of wolves coming back. So they had to think about it very differently. And for a couple of years, they were actually thinking about this from a philosophical point of view. They employed conservationists. I met this guy, Peter Venema, at a conference, and he told me that his job was to help the government to philosophically consider what the return of the wolf meant for the Netherlands as a nation. And I just found that extraordinary, that you know, that could be a way that we could think about an animal like this. There we are. I've got my screen sharing back. Look at that. So so I went to meet people, and we went out into the Veluwe forest, which is where the first wolf pack had become established over a couple of years. And the wolves in the Netherlands group, what they were really doing was to safeguard the wolves' presence by saying, if people encountered wolves, it's not a problem, it's just a situation. And of course, wolves don't want to be near people. And of course, we tell ourselves all kinds of stories about what wolves might do and might not do, and most of them are very negative. So they saw their really central job as keeping the hysteria down. And we actually went out the day after this conference into the Veluwe. I went with a couple of the volunteers to look. Well, I said to Ellen, the woman who was running it, you know, will we see wolves? And she said, we don't go out looking for them. It's not a zoo. We have to let them get on with living their lives and going through the processes that they go through. And I suppose that was a wake-up call for me. Anyway, I did see a wolf. I saw it for about 20 seconds early one morning when we were out in the forest. And it just looked as if it was going for an amble morning stroll. It wasn't bothered about me. It was about 80 yards away. And it just went back into the forest. And when I caught up with the others and told them what I'd seen, Yap said to me, oh yeah, well, that's very possible. That's a wildlife resting area. And that was another lesson, because we don't have wildlife resting areas in this country. It's the human animal who's given precedent the whole time. And, you know, the rest of us are not able to impact on that. You know, we just have to, you know, we don't have another way of thinking about things. And I think we could do very well, actually, if we started to allocate wildlife resting areas to take the pressure off species, especially in a place like the Lake District. But then anyway, then I was doing all this research and found a video clip of the first wolf to be seen in the Netherlands. First wolf to be seen, that is. Who knows which was the first wolf? So this is just a little clip from the book. There's another clip of a wolf running through a field at the edge of an industrial zone. In the background, just beyond the buildings, is the grey North Sea. There's a wind farm, a factory, a single train track towards which the lone wolf runs. Think of wolves and you think of forests and mountains, not this inauspicious, human-entangled industrial zone. Someone is filming the wolf using an extended zoom, and the wolf is running inland away from the coast. Everything is grey, the film grainy. Wind buffets the microphone and there's fine rain in the air. With a film in black and white, you could be forgiven for thinking a scene from Tarkovsky's Stalker was unfolding. This film was of the first wolf to enter the Netherlands in more than 150 years. It had crossed from Germany some 50 kilometres to the east, which of course is no distance at all for a wolf. Watching the clip, I see the wolf in the thick of it all. I see the wolf in the thick of it all, amongst our green power, our transport, our mess. A cyclist turns into the road to the wind farm less than 10 metres away from the wolf. A truck has stopped at the side of the rail track and someone gets out. I wonder if they've noticed the wolf. The person filming talks to his companion, but I can't discern what's being said. I think of how a friend of mine once said that wolves don't walk or run so much as float above the ground. And here comes this lone wolf floating above the winter field. As the film continues, the wolf pauses, looks around and moves on. A car pulls up at the junction at the same time as the wolf crosses it, and the car waits for the wolf, presumably because the person inside it knows exactly what they're seeing. When it's cleared the junction, the wolf begins to run, but not in the confident lope of a wild thing in its element. The wolf appears distracted, bewildered even by our modernity. As I watch, what I see is how the wolf might have just been delivered through a portal from another age into a place and time where nothing is as it should be. Perhaps that's not so very far from the truth. As it runs towards another road junction, the wolf constantly looks around, slowing down, looking again, but it continues loping forwards in its intangible, doubtful fashion. I can't help but feel for the wolf, an animal lost at sea amongst tarmac and steel, streetlights and power lines. I suppose this is the nature of pioneering, of wandering into the unknown, into a place where our cliched expectations are blown to smithereens. The wolf just entered the postmodern age. So there we are. If you fancy a Google on YouTube, just Google wolves in the Netherlands. There was another clip that I found of a wolf running past suburban gardens, you know, with white picket fences and model windmills in the front gardens. And then I met another of the team, Glenn, who said, "Oh yeah, my house is on that film, and that wolf ran past my house, and I was in the house when the wolf ran past, and I didn't see it, and I work on wolves," you know. So it was like he was really, really fed up about that. But anyway, they were a fantastic group of people. Another interesting thing there is that they have this system of working with volunteers. And again, to keep the hysteria down, a couple of the women go and meet farmers. They ask them if they're bothered about wolves attacking the sheep. And they say things like, well, we can help you. You know, we can put up fences because wolves don't jump fences. And so they will, from this very pragmatic approach, they'll say to the farmer, you buy the fencing, we'll put it up for you. Job done. You know, and you just think, can you imagine that happening in this country? Just a bunch of volunteers going and saying to farmers, I'll help you sort this out, you know. So it's just a very, very different approach, and I think it speaks volumes to our kind of island mentality. Anyway, so that's that. Then we're going to move on, and it's frozen again. Oh no, it's come back. Maybe it's just taking a while to do it, is it? There we are. So there's a stalk and we're moving geographically a bit further east. We're going to Hungary now. So there are actually 3 essays from Hungary. One is about a bird rescue centre we went to. The second is about bringing back the Imperial Eagle from the edge of extinction in Hungary. And the third, very little essay, is about a guy called Tomasz, who runs a meadow adder breeding programme, because there are so few meadow adders left in Hungary. The reason for the decline is because, of course, of agribusiness. And what I learned going through Europe was that, I mean, I don't know whether this pertains in this country, but you go to a country like Hungary and you get these massive agribusiness fields, massive fields of sunflowers, corn. They're the 2 most common things that you see. But the lorries going to get them, they're not from Hungary. They're big corporations from either Holland or Austria that come in, they trash the local roads, and they're not obliged to fix them. So there's a lot there that's not right. But then there's a lot that is right, because the Hungarian government decided to get on board with things like bringing back the great bustard from the edge of extinction. So on the first day I went with my friend Zabi, and we met the great bustard team. What was interesting about that was, just before we get onto the bird rescue centre, is that all these guys have got all the tech in their cars, in their 4x4s, and you've got you might have a bustard and it's got a tag on it, so the bustard lies down for an afternoon nap, and before you know it, everybody's being sent alarms saying this bustard stop moving, and so somebody will get a signal, the nearest person, and they'll go off to investigate. So it's like you can't even lie down for a nap without having people worrying about whether you've copped it in some way. So, you know, it's a kind of bustard surveillance. You know, it's again, it's kind of, I suppose it's equivalent to people tagging sea eagles and things like that, but it just struck me as quite amusing, really. So yeah, we went off to a bird rescue centre because we'd found in the guest house where we were staying, one of their Siamese kittens had got hold of a little whitethroat, a juvenile whitethroat, and its leg was broken. And so there's a section in the book where I describe Judith, our host, helping me put it into a plastic cake box. And you think, what an undignified way to be transported when you're kind of capable of migration and all that. That we took it, fortunately, in Hortobège, where we were staying, literally half a mile down the road, there's this incredible bird rescue centre. So off we trotted with this poor little whitethroat, which probably didn't make it. But then we encountered all these vets doing incredible surgery on injured birds. And I said, it's like a sort of demented sideshow. You know, all these cubicles you can walk through, you can actually see birds being operated on. We saw a stork having its leg amputated. The stork was out cold. One of the vet assistants that was holding it looked utterly bored, you know, and I thought, God, you know, maybe that's just, there's so many birds coming through to be fixed that it's become boring. And so what's behind this? Well, there are 2 main drivers of this. Well, 3 actually. One is a lot of raptors are still being poisoned by hunters putting out poisoned carcasses, which are not intended for the raptors. They're intended for mammals like the golden jackal. But of course raptors come in. So there's been a huge move to actually work with hunters, to get hunters on side, and it's been quite phenomenal actually, the number of hunters who will now, they no longer use poison dumps, but of course there are some who do. So some of that collateral comes into this centre. If you can get an injured a poisoned raptor to the vets within an hour, then they've got a very good chance of recovery. Outside that, basically the poison's ingested and they don't make it. And then there are things like very poor electricity infrastructure. So you get a bird like a Saker falcon or a kestrel will land on an electricity pylon, but the insulation is so poor that they basically get their legs fried. And it's quite horrendous, really. So that's why we saw this stork having its leg amputated below the knee. But then again, what the vets do is inside, once we'd gone through this kind of freak show corridor, we went out into the grounds, and they have a huge enclosure with mini pylons in it, with mini wires and a ticking noise, and the ticking is electric fence, and they're training the birds that you cannot land on electrical infrastructure because you're going to get hurt. So it's got a very low voltage. It's a deterrent. And then the number of birds who go through this place and are actually then released again is phenomenal. And the ones that can't be released, like they started doing at Knepp in Sussex, that they can actually breed. So they can keep them in captivity, and then the young are released. So it's a kind of win-win, all run on voluntary contributions. So it was really quite phenomenal. And then I went with the reason I had all these trips in Hungary, by the way, is I have a friend who's a wildlife artist called Szabolcs Kokai, and he's mentioned in the book. And he's a friend, and he's an incredible wildlife artist. So if you get the chance to look at his work online, and he's a member of the British Society of Wildlife Artists, and we'd met through some work that I was doing, promoting an exhibition of wader art. Anyway, so Sabi set all these trips up for me. He'd actually worked in conservation, he'd worked for BirdLife International, so he had all the right contacts. And the next day we went off to spend a day with his mate Imre, looking at the Imperial Eagle. And this was a bird that had more or less disappeared from Hungary because of raptor persecution during the communist era. People didn't want raptors around because they saw them as a threat to their food. So, and again, the poisoning was an issue. So we were driving around all these huge places, and let's see if that moves on. Yeah, so this is a white-tailed sea eagle that was brought into one of the a different rescue centre actually, and all the white you can see is just it's the guy's glove holding its beak. This had actually been hit by a car. That's the third main reason for injury. That's an incredibly beautiful thing, you know, and that vital eye. And then we went off looking at Imperial Eagles. It doesn't seem to want to move on again. There we are. That's what I wanted. So this is the kind of habitat where Imperial Eagles tend to nest. On the back of protection, they've really made a comeback. They're being very closely monitored by the team. And this is an abandoned farm. So very frequently we would be driving across these oceans of stubble around the edge of crops of sweet corn, or what's the other big one, the sunflowers, massive amounts of sunflowers. And then you would see these little oases with roofs poking up, or you would see something, and these are little abandoned farms. So if you can imagine, before agribusiness got going, that was Hungary. It was a whole series of small farms like this and small producers. It really speaks to a kind of another way of life. And you know, if I'd had to set off from there were no roads. There were no roads back to the main road. I wouldn't have had a clue how to get back there. You know, you're completely off grid, except that Imre has his technology on the front of his dashboard, and wherever you go, all his movements are tracked. And the birds, when the young are born, when they hatch rather, they'll go up and get the young and tag them, put rings on them, and they monitor them with drones if necessary. And in one of the trees above this little building was a juvenile, and we were collecting feathers from underneath the tree. We were collecting foodstuffs. Imre found the skull of a cat. This is the remains of a roe deer. They would eat roe deer. So you can see why people in days of food shortages saw this kind of species as a threat to their food security, I guess. And we collected all this up as evidence, and Imre would take it away and he would check the birds. They could get little tiny blood samples from the shafts of feathers and make sure that the birds were healthy. But this cat skull was really fascinating to me, and I wondered what it was. And he said, well, it could be a wild cat, or it could be a domestic cat. And later, when we were looking at some of these data maps showing the movements of birds, there was one particular Imperial Eagle from a nest that we went to that was going shopping. I called it shopping in Jasperani. And you could see that it was obviously going back, and it had found a supply and somebody's chickens in their back garden, and it was popping them off. And but also they do take cats, so we don't know. There was a heron skull. In fact, the essay begins with a list of some of the species that they'd taken. So so that was absolutely amazing, having this time with Imre and just looking at all this fantastic attention. And now there are so many Imperial Eagles in Hungary that the birds are starting to move out into adjacent countries. And one of the interesting things is that Imre said that there's one line of hills in Hungary, and for somebody like me that spent my life looking at mountains, I couldn't get my head around it. And Sabi said, oh yeah, we once went to the hills for a day. And now I can't get my head around that. I can't get my head around living in such a flat place. I mean, it makes Norfolk look like the Pyrenees. But the birds were actually moving up when they were being persecuted into this range of hills. And when the persecution stopped, they started moving back down again. And it's really interesting, you know. I'm not saying that the birds had a sense, but there was something going on that they had an awareness about where they were safe or they weren't safe. I don't know how you'd interpret that, but anyway, just an interesting observation. So let's see what we get next, if this obliges.
And so Karen, it's me who's controlling the photos.
Oh, it is you. That's great, Rachel. Yeah. So here, thank you very much.
Yeah. just tell me when to move them on.
We'll get there in the end. So this is an adult, I think it's an adult Imperial Eagle in flight. And if you go on again, I think, Rachel, that's one of the juveniles that we saw. Extraordinary birds, just so beautiful. And seeing them flying around was just incredible. And there's a moment in the book where I describe an Imperial Eagle being scrutinized by a Saker falcon. So the Saker falcon's up high, and then it's got a young with it, and it's mobbing, you know, this tiny Saker falcon is mobbing this massive Imperial Eagle, you know. But I guess that's just how it is. But again, it just speaks to what we've lost. You know, we should have golden eagles. As Mark Cocker once said to me, there should be golden eagles in Derbyshire. You know, where are they? Well, there's a story to tell about why we don't have them, you know. So anyway, so can we move on again, Rachel, please? So this is a picture I took a year or two ago. I've gone out for a walk up above Ullswater with my brother. And we met these two ladies on ponies and had a very nice chat with them. And, you know, I've spent my life walking in the hills. And this is where we come back to this story about what's wrong with the Lake District, really. Why don't we see wildlife? Well, you can more or less see the answer there for yourselves. I mean, it's a beautiful landscape, but where's the tree cover? And where are the corridors of connectivity from one valley to the next? And the answer is they're just not there. So one conservationist described the Lake District to me as a biodiversity dead end. And, you know, we tell ourselves all kinds of stories. And one of the big disservices I think we've done to the Lake District, especially in the face of, of climate change and biodiversity loss, is to slap this preservation order on it that the World Heritage inscription has done. And so that's really interesting to me to think about. Why would you inscribe a place as a cultural landscape when it hasn't got very much in the way of biodiversity? And people who are working to bring back that biodiversity then become the pariahs who are not liked, basically, by the World Heritage people. What the World Heritage people seem to want, and if any of them are listening, I'd really welcome a conversation about this. They want this, which is basically effectively a dead landscape. And it doesn't end there, because then, of course, you've got things like in the middle of Kendal, where I live, a 78 million and counting concrete flood walls defence scheme going up after Storm Desmond. And you don't have to be a mathematician to work out that 2 and 2 doesn't make, doesn't add up when you've got this, but you've got major flooding downstream, and the landscape basically is not able to ameliorate climate change. The soils are being washed away. We share our allotment with a couple who work for Natural England, and I learn an awful lot from them. But basically, once the soils have gone under our increasingly heavy rains, we won't be replanting because there won't be any ability to replant. University, we're having a conference this July coming, on reimagining landscapes, bringing together ecologists, writers, artists, filmmakers, all kinds of people, to think about how we should be doing this, because we're not really communicating the actual state of affairs. And I think that's doing a very great disservice, not only to the landscape, but to its wild inhabitants, where they are doing well at places like Ennerdale and Haweswater, and nor is it doing very much at all for people who live downstream and who are then much more likely to flood during climate events. But anyway, point is, how do you communicate all this without kind of turning people off? And it's very close to my heart, this subject, as you can imagine. I've lived here most of my life. But one of the things, coming back to the idea of the essay, one of the things that the essay allows you to do is to approach things differently, or to play around with structure in the essay. I called this essay Viewing Stations, and it's got lots of little sections called Station 1, Station 2, Station 3. Now, the very erudite amongst you might get this. There was in 1778, I think it was, Thomas West, this travelling cleric, published the first guidebook to the Lake District, in which he set up all these numbered viewing stations. So basically, you go here, you stand on that rock, you look at the view, and then you move on to the next one. So that's what I'm kind of playing around with. Also, like Rachel said earlier, I do like using humour as a way of getting at things. And so I thought about how the World Heritage Inscription has wheeled out people like William Wordsworth and Beatrix Potter as reasons why this should be defended or promoted rather as a cultural landscape. And so I kind of thought about this and how I was going to approach it. So I decided to bring them both back to life. Actually, 3 of them. I brought Thomas West back to life as well. And then I invented a literary festival. And I said, once you've got over the fact that you're sitting next to people who shouldn't be there, this is how the conversation went. So it's just trying to kind of approach the subject with a bit of humour. Sometimes I daydream about what those pioneering conservationists, William Wordsworth and Beatrix Potter, might have to say if they see things from this point in the evolution of the world. In this imagining, I have them take part in a panel discussion in a Lake District Literary Festival, and to make sure that there's a balanced set of views. And because I see him as a sort of 18th century manifestation of the World Heritage way of looking at things, I also invite Thomas West. Once they and we have got used to the idea of sitting beside people who should not, of course, be there, I also imagine someone, it could possibly be me, putting their hand in the air, and what this person says goes something like this. I'd like to know how you feel about the idea of preserving this landscape as cultural in this time of climate breakdown and failing biodiversity. We'll assume for the purposes of the exercise that our illustrious guests are familiar with these 21st century terms. Do you think we should preserve the landscape as it is, that this should be the precedent, the guiding principle of how we see the land? Or do you think there's a moral obligation to look more closely at what the land is telling us? I'm beginning to think that this person is one of those literary festival types who comes across as a little bit too self-important. This person, who might or might not be me, looks William directly in the eye and says, "I remember the bit in your poem about the leech gatherer, the questions you ask him in the poem. How is it that you live, and what is it you do? Do you think we should be asking ourselves those same questions?" Imagine them like this. William has his hands clasped together on the table in front of him. He nods his head slowly back and forth. And from his demeanour, I assume that he understands what this person is getting at and thinks that their questions are useful and valid. I am, though, concerned about Thomas West. I think he's going to toe the World Heritage Party line. But think of all the tourists. And perhaps, like in a cartoon, dollar signs begin ringing up in his eyes. Beatrix Potter, meanwhile, shuffles her sensible sheep farmer's best shoes underneath the table. Perhaps she feels conflicted about the relationship between sheep and the loss of biodiversity. Maybe she doesn't think she can say what might be coming more and more to the front of her mind. But let's remind ourselves that as well as being an illustrator and storyteller, Potter was an astute scientist. She was the first to identify the reproduction systems of lichens. She grew fungal spores on glass plates and tracked their development under the microscope. Beatrix Potter fundamentally understood the nature of cause and effect. There's an uncomfortable pause, and then William speaks. "I don't know what to say. I was poet laureate, but here I am, rudely posited back into a landscape that I simultaneously recognise and don't, and I'm lost for words." He gestures towards the landscape outside our imaginary festival. "I'm also lost for knowing how it is I should feel when I'm confronted by the nature, or the lack of nature, in the Lake District in your century." And William looks at us as we begin to shift uncomfortably in our seats and asks, "What on earth have you done?" So there we are. That's the Lake District in a nutshell. And if anybody wants to come to our conference, you're very welcome. Just ask Rachel and I can get details sent to you. Or if you know anybody who might be interested in joining in, we've got some fab speakers coming. Anyway, we can move on now, having put the Lake District to rights, and we're going to go to a place that's a little bit more forested, to say the least. And this is Piatta Crayola National Park in Transylvania, where I went a few years ago now. Can't remember exactly which year it was. COVID makes everything into a blur, doesn't it? So 2 years kind of parachute into what seems to be a few months. Anyway, so here we are. I went with my elder son, Callum. I'm not really a very well-travelled person, and although I'd travelled to lots of other places on my own, Romania felt a bit far away, a bit maybe challenging. I needn't have worried. It's the most incredible country. The people are incredible. Yes, you get fleeced by taxi drivers if you're not careful, but on the whole, you know, it's just amazing. The people are so generous. And we spent quite a lot of time in the mountains with the rangers from a project called Foundation of Conservation in the Carpathians. This was set up by a couple of wolf scientists, actually, called Barbara and Christoph Promberger. And they had gone to the Carpathians to study wolves. And they'd been walking in the mountains and then found this scene of absolute desolation, where illegal loggers had moved in. And what had happened was, so we all know what happened to Ceausescu after the end of communism. Quite rightly, the state began to repatriate pockets of forest back to the original owners. But these people had lived in abject poverty for many, many years, decades. And like any of us would have done, they sold the forest logging rights to whoever would buy. And again, you had big companies coming in from Austria and elsewhere. And so these forests had just begun to be ripped apart. The worst thing you can do to a forest is put a road in. And of course, they were putting roads in and putting logging roads in everywhere. If you look carefully at this picture, on the hill in the middle distance, you can see a sort of rim of sunlight. And if you look down from that, it's a different level of green than the one above it on the brow of the hill. That's actually a new area of forest. That was all illegally logged. And the project are now restoring the forest. They have tree nurseries. They're working with local communities. We met some of the Roma people that they're working with. And of course, the point is that if you have these massive gaps in the forests, then the wolves and the bears and the lynx and all the other animals that should be there are being pushed further and further out. So we found out an awful lot about illegal logging. If you can move on to the next slide, Rachel, please. We went into the Danbowitz Valley, which is probably the most remote place I've ever been. This is quite typical, these kind of gorges we had to pass through. We were like 50, 60 miles from the nearest road, the nearest main road, I should say. And this is a very, very peasant economy where people are really reeling from the effects of capitalism and how many families are leaving the countryside behind, moving into the cities. And we actually saw there's lots of houses with for sale signs on, and we saw so many of these, and a school that had just been built, but no children had ever gone into the school because by the time it was built, all the families in the village had moved away, which is a real indictment, isn't it, about what cities do to rural communities. So a lot of the people we saw were very elderly, and lots of beautiful, exquisite wooden architecture, these houses just crumbling away, all with for sale signs on. So if you move on, Rachel, please. So here we are, here's some of the Roma people. They were expertly using their mattocks to get the weeds away from the trees. And as we went over to say hello, I thought I was walking through a field, and then to my horror, one of the guides we were with pointed at my feet, and I'd just trampled on all these trees, because little tiny baby trees, you know, and it's like, oh, terrible moment. Anyway, we weren't able to communicate with these people. They didn't speak English, but they were just doing an amazing job. And then we carried on up into the mountains. And if you move on again, Rachel, please. This is what we were looking for. So you might want to take a guess at what that is. It's bear poo, bear scat. And as Liviu, our wonderful guide, who I've stayed in touch with, said, if you're a bear, it's very difficult to hide what you've been eating. This one's been eating sweet corn. There were lots of bears had been eating apples and orchard fruits. It was September when we were there. So what the rangers do when you come across something like this, they stop. If it's fresh enough, they take samples, then they can genetically identify the animals. Then if there's a particular problem, they can get hold of an animal and relocate it. And I think, I'm not sure how much longer you want me to speak for, Rachel. So rather than, I'd like to read you a little bit from Romania. What do you think? How many more minutes would you like me to speak for?
Yeah, we've got another five minutes or so.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. So we spent most time with Liviu, who was just incredible. I mean, he was like a walking encyclopedia about forest life. The other one, Bogdan, probably the most dangerous thing that happened to us was being driven by Bogdan, because he was going far too fast, and Callum didn't have a seatbelt in the back of the car, and it was just like, anyway, we lived to tell the tale. But yeah, you don't really see the bears during the day. I can honestly say it was the most out of my comfort zone I've ever been. But after a few days, we kind of started to get used to it. And just very, very special time. I just am desperate to go back to Romania. I just think it's the most astonishing country. So we did all that with the guides. Do you want to just move on again, Rachel? This is Danbowitz. It's a huge reservoir now there. You can see a building. That is the new wildlife lodge that the project has built. So their way of trying to bring back economy to these rural areas is on ecotourism. So you could rent out that lodge and hope that bears and wolves might pass the door. And of course, part of the enticement is that people put food out for them. So We don't know whether that lodge was actually open at the time we were there, but we didn't get up to it. This is taken on a massive telephoto lens. But on the last night, I paid for us to go on a bear watching trip because we hadn't seen any during the day. And that was, and this passage describes what we saw. This is further south of Brasov, and again with forest rangers. Excuse me, I've gone a bit croaky. And so we walk into the forest for about half a mile from the edge of the road. In the centre of the clearing was a big male. The guide told us, its back marked with a splash of pale fur. I focused the binoculars on the bear's immense tubular snout, and then on those great bare claws, and remembered the scored marks of the claws in the red earth of that first walk with living. Another bear was sprawled over a horizontal section of tree and was pushing his snout into the trough, chiselled into the trunk as a container for food. Whenever another bear came close, this particular bear was agitated, antsy. 4 juveniles emerged from the trees. One of them clambered onto another trunk. The second followed. Another reached up with his paws on either side of the trough. The fourth remained on the ground, hoovering up all the corn the others spilled. When bears first emerge from hibernation, the guide said, they're very wary of the world outside. Throughout the spring and summer, their confidence increases. By September, the bears have become finely attuned to the forestry Land Rover's burr as the rangers bring food into the clearing. And I wondered what that must be like to go on ahead as the female guide had that evening, and to move about the clearing, pouring corn into the troughs chiselled into the trunks of those specially toppled trees, watching for bears from the eyes in the back of your head. Another male ambled into the clearing, a granddaddy of a bear, the weighty claws swinging inwardly as he shambled forwards, the coat striated with browns and golds and greys. And next, toddling down the bear-worn path into the clearing, came 3 little bears, each marked by a distinctive white furry collar. I think if you move on, we might see them, Rachel. Oh, that's just a bit of, there's one of the houses for sale. If you carry on again, there we are, there's the 3 baby bears. A moment later, the mother bear paced along the path into the clearing and continued walking nervously up and down, swinging her great head from side to side, her massive snout quivering, testing the air, and I couldn't take in how enormous, how bear-like she was. Through the binoculars, I saw how she panted, as if being in the clearing was the most testing, most vulnerable place for her to be with her offspring, and she displayed an anxiety, a tangible physical presence. Something resonated about the vulnerability I had experienced regarding my own and my son's safety in the forest, but I had not considered that bears are also a danger to bears. Another bear waded into a deep puddle at the side of the clearing and plonked himself down in the water like a person in the bath, sliding until he was half lying, half sitting, most of his bulk submerged. The bear was searching for something. This bear loves water, the guide said. And then the bear retrieved the stick he'd deposited the day before and proceeded to chew one end before dexterously turning it around and chewing the other. Then the 3 bear cubs were roly-poling on their sides down the sandy bank, biting each other's paws and ears. And by now, the mother was apoplectic with anxiety. And as she paced up and down, it triggered a memory of teenagers still not home, an hour after they should have been, mobile phones unanswered. A juvenile bear headed towards the hide, passing only a metre or 2 below the window, so that I was able to look directly into its eyes. And for a small moment only, the bear looked into mine. I think we've got a shot of that, Rachel, if you move on. There's the mother bear with the 3 babies. And if you move on, there's the bear in the bath. And then I think the next one, there it is. So we were in a wooden hide, but obviously the bears knew that humans were there. It was clear the bear knew we were there, and from the bear's point of view, I suppose we were something to be endured if they were to take advantage of that effortless and regular supply of food. Into the quietest corner of the clearing, a small mother bear entered, and at her side a cub, not very old at all. This, the guide said, was a very young, very inexperienced first-time mother. To give birth to a single cub is a genetic way of allowing young bear mothers to learn the craft of motherhood. Each time she twitched or gave out some hidden signal, The cub scarpered up the nearest tree and waited apprehensively, peering anxiously down at the ground beneath. Moments later, down it came, its unease evident, and scrambled the short distance back to the mother. And so it went, this dance between mother and cub and tree and ground. After a few minutes, the cub shot back up the tree as a much larger female ambled over, and with her snout and head barged the new mother out of the way to pirate a cob of sweet corn. Of course, the new mother understood her place in the bare scheme of things. She'd had enough. With a short, high-pitched whine, the new mother called to her cub. And when finally it clawed its uncertain way down the trunk, stopping and pausing, scrutinizing the space underneath, they scarpered away into the trees as if a huge brown male bear was on their tail. There we go. So I think we've probably run out of time for more from the book, but it'd be really nice to have some questions.
So I'll stop sharing and return to. So if you'd like to ask Karen a question, thank you, Karen. That was such a lovely talk, and also I think the readings were wonderful with the pictures alongside them, and such a vision of the animals as you're talking about and the birds. So if you'd like to ask Karen a question, can you wave? Can you also unmute yourself? And if you want to put your video back on, then obviously you're very welcome to do that. So questions for Karen from anybody? Steve, is that you putting your hand up? Steve?
No, I don't think so.
You need to unmute if you're asking a question, Steve. No. No. Right. Sorry. Yeah.
Right. No,
Yeah, Steve.
sorry, Sheila. All I was going to say is.
Yeah. So let Steve go ahead. Okay.
Everybody's moving in Hungary. Everybody's moving out of the villages and into the cities. Does that give the wildlife more room?
In Romania or in Hungary?
Sorry, was it? I thought you said Hungary.
Well, I guess it's happening in both places, actually, is the short answer. I mean, you know, across Europe, people are moving into cities. And I think that where the tension is with this agribusiness. It's the same as the UK, that you get these huge companies, huge fields. You know, when you're flying over Hungary, it's just a patchwork of massive fields. But there are people out there doing this amazing stuff. And some of the landowners we met no, we didn't meet. We went to a farm that a lady who was 106 years old wanted to give to the Eagle project. And they said, no, we're not having it given. We have to buy it off you. And there was a neighbouring farmer who also found out that the Eagle project had money. And so they said, well, you can have ours, but it's like 1.5 million florins or whatever, you know. And they said, no, thanks. They knew they were being exploited. So this idea that there are people who lived more traditionally, who recognize the value of what was there, they've got that cultural memory, right? And I think that's really important. And the other guy represents sort of rabid, rampant post modernist capitalism, really. I suppose that for me summed up the difference. But there are a lot of things like roe deer live in the sweet corn. I mean, it's like a forest to them.
Life
and the
sunflowers. Moving out.
So there are, I suppose the short answer is there are losses and gains. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. Another question?
I totally agree with the comments about the Lake District. It's basically become a desert grazed by sheep. And yeah, unfortunately, there are quite large areas of the Peak District that are virtually the same.
Yeah.
And I mean, I don't know whether things will change now we've come out of the European Union, where a lot of landowners were encouraged on acreage to put sheep on it.
Yeah.
I mean, there is hope there, but also, you know, I do get, there's a conflict with Derbyshire Wildlife Trust, who seem to have this fanatic opinion that any bits of scrub that, you know, invade the Dales, they call it scrub bashing and seem determined to get rid of it. But there's so few areas of woodland and scrub around that I think I've got a real conflict about that, because I don't think they've clearly thought through the value of what, you know, they call scrub. And I think it's incredibly important habitat for lots of species.
I think you're absolutely right. And I can't comment on what's happening where you are, but that sounds like very backwards thinking. But I have a mate who works for Natural England, and the first little symposium we had to bring people together to think about the Lake District, he gave a talk and he said the bulk of species live in scrub, not in trees. The most biodiversity lives in scrub, which was something I hadn't known. So it feels a bit self-defeatist if you're going to take away the scrub.
Yeah. Thanks, Karen. Jill, do you have a question?
Yes, Karen, I was very interested in what you said about the Netherlands and the wolves moving in. The Netherlands is so densely settled.
Yes, it is.
I find it hard to envisage how the wolves find anything to eat at all. Are they dependent on wildlife wardens making sure they get fed, or are they learning to forage in the fields?
No, again, if you look on YouTube, I found a clip of a wolf running down a street, and looked like it was going to the corner shop, you know, and there's a cyclist goes past it. And these are all the sort of pioneer wolves who are finding their way. But they're totally wild animals. They're not being fed. It comes back to Ellen's comment about it's not a zoo. You know, we don't go looking for them. We have to let natural processes happen. And there's plenty of food for them. So in a place like the Veluwe National Park, there's loads of roe deer, there's red deer, all sorts of stuff, you know, and they've been putting camera traps up. We went to inspect one of Yap's camera traps to see if there'd been any wolves around, and they're just there, you know, they're just doing. And it's interesting because one of the things I did learn was that you don't have to have a forest to be a wolf. What you need is somewhere quiet and dark. And so that could be a field. It could be a bit of scrub. It could be somebody's garden, you know, but it's unlikely they would be in gardens. But one of the volunteers that I met, she and her husband lived in the Veluwe forest, and he was a forester. And she got out of the house one day, went to get in her car, and there was this bloody trail leading back into the forest. They have a lot of wild boar there, and a wolf had killed a wild boar outside the house and then dragged the carcass back into the forest, or probably disabled the wild boar, and then you know, and wolves work in packs to hunt. So and when you walk, we went into the forest at night one night looking, actually we were doing something that I describe, well, it's called bioacoustic surveying. So the golden jackal has been seen in the Netherlands for the first time in the history of the species. And again, they were thinking, well, how do we accommodate an animal that's not been here before? And so one of the things they did was they had a conference to think about this. And again, can you imagine that here, you know, oh, I don't know, the golden jackal is coming back to Britain. We better have a conference and have a bit of a think about this. You know, it's just a different mentality. But we went out into the forest at night to do this bioacoustic surveying. And, you know, there are huge amounts of red deer in those forests. But the moon came out and it was incredible. It was a wonderful experience. And I did enjoy writing that bit of the book, and how your eyes get accommodated to the dark and you start to see more. But if you were walking, you could not take your eyes off where your feet were, because it was like the Somme, and that was from the numbers of wild boar that live in the forest. So there is plenty of food for the wolves.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you. Dave,
yeah.
and then Pat.
Thanks very much, Karen. I haven't read your book yet, but I fully intend to.
Thanks.
From the title, abundance, it seems to be fairly positive. It's very easy in this country to start feeling very depressed about nature. But are you fairly optimistic? Do you think the tide is turning, or there is generally a shift towards recovery?
Ew, I hate being asked that question. I think we have to live with some hope, don't we?
Yeah.
You know, I don't think that human animals are capable of living without it, really. I think we're in trouble, and I've had different things said to me about who will be okay, who won't be okay. Yes, we've got sea level rise, all that. It's all almost a bit too big for us to get hold of. We need governments to do much more than they are doing. Every morning I say to my husband, why can't we buy an orange juice carton without a plastic catch on it? You know, why are we trapped into the way that we're supplied with things? You know, and we're all grappling with that stuff. But say in the Lake District, I have met and actually wrote about in this essay, Viewing Stations, a young couple who'd come back to live on the farm that their parents and grandparents had run, and they completely changed the way the farming is taking place. They're doing regenerative farming. The land is being looked after. The soil is being restructured. The wildflowers are coming back. The pollinators are coming back. It's all happening. And on top of all that, they produce absolutely top quality beef. You know, and it's not fed on anything. They're not given ivermectin. They're not given, you know, they're not doused with anything. It's as natural as it can be. And I see more and more of that happening. There are more and more farmers, young farmers coming in. And I should say, I never get into farmer bashing because I was brought up amongst farming community. And if I was a farmer and the EU had offered me a very nice subsidy to farm sheep, I would have done it, wouldn't we all? And so it's to do with how things are funded. And so let's just keep our fingers crossed that this government, this shower, actually say what they have said they're going to do with environmental grants and to farm more with nature. But I think that's a tough journey for older farmers to go along, people who've got very used to doing one way of things and then they're asked to change. I don't envy those people having to do that.
Okay, thank you. And final question, Pat, you had a question, I think?
Yes, could you tell me a bit more about these World Heritage organisations? Presumably in sort of parts of the country where we have literary figures. I mean, I suppose Hardy's Dorset and perhaps Dylan Thompson's Way, these sort of places. You say there are organisations that actually runs a sort of landscape project in these areas.
Well, as I understand it, and I'm not an expert on World Heritage, it has many different manifestations. I mean, I went to Pompeii, and Pompeii, quite rightly, has been preserved as a cultural landscape. You know, nobody could argue with that, could they? Of course, we want to preserve Pompeii. It's a no-brainer. But then, and it's interesting because I've been talking to people in World Heritage in Europe, and one of them just sent me some conference papers. And one of the things that they're concerned with is protecting World Heritage sites against global warming. You know, how do you protect buildings from sea level rise or artifacts or, you know, areas? How do you do that? Well, actually, if you're asking those questions, you should be asking questions about what's happening in the Lake District. And my idea of a cultural landscape, I'm not saying get rid of World Heritage. What I would say is, this is my master plan, is that you don't take away the World Heritage, but you set up the Lake District as the first transition, World Heritage transition landscape. And you say, we're going to work towards restoration. We're going to build as much biodiversity as we can because we're morally obligated to do that. And we're also morally obligated to plant trees and scrub, both for biodiversity and for climate amelioration. And then you get other people following. I mean, it's a bit like NET, isn't it, in Sussex, you know, the amazing work they've done. You know, people jump on the bandwagon. loads of landowners are doing that stuff now. Why can't we do that with World Heritage? And I think to keep the idea that sheep are some kind of cultural landscape it's bonkers. If you flew somebody in from another planet and said, look, this denuded landscape, well, sorry, mate, but it's got to stay like that because we want to keep these sheep here, they would think you were barking mad. And, you know, I'm sorry, but I think it's an abomination in its current guise. But let's transform it.
Yeah.
Let's just change it.
Yeah.
And there are people doing some great stuff in the Lake District. Yeah.
Thank you. Oh, Pat, sorry, Pat, you're muted. Yeah.
About that.
Yeah. So just very quickly, Pat, because we're just rounding up, I think now.
Right.
Do you want to come back?
Do the World Heritage Organization actually own the land? Or
No.
do they just,
No.
Right.
It's just a designation, an inscription. Yeah.
Right. Thank you.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay. Right. Well, thank you very much. Thank you to everybody for listening. Thank you to everybody for the questions. But most of all, thank you very much to Karen for a wonderful evening, a wonderful talk, Karen. Thank you so much. And if people want to unmute, can we just give Karen a round of applause? For
thank
her
you.
talk tonight. All right. Thank you.
Well, thanks to you all for staying in the comfort of your homes on a night like this.
Thank you. And just before we finish, can I remind you that our next talk, which fits in very nicely with this actually, after the comments that you made, Karen, about soil and soil being washed away and soil porosity, if you like. Our next talk in 2 weeks' time, on Saturday the 19th, is about soil and how it degrades, how we improve it, why that matters. And that's going to be with James Sweetman. So hopefully we'll see you in 2 weeks' time. So thank you very much. Have a good rest of your weekend. And Karen, thank you so much. It's been brilliant.
Oh, thanks, Rachel. Thanks for having me. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you then. Good night.
Bye.
Bye.